All right, welcome everybody. I'm Elias Krim. I'm the director of Solidarity Hall.
You've been with Strong Towns a long time,
like, I might
Elias.
as well be the co-director of Strong Towns. No, not quite. But I have been a long-term fan. That is for sure. So this is a long-standing conversation. This is the second in a new thing that Solidarity Hall is doing called a Eutopia Workshop. Chuck is not a utopian. I'm not exactly a utopian, but I might explain that we're not spelling it the usual way. This is not utopia as in the sense of no place. This is utopia with an E, which means a place of well-being with a practical aspiration. That's according to the dictionary. You know, I want to quote an old utopian before we start off on this workshop. A guy named Murray Bookchin wrote quite a few years ago about these moments when, you know, we live double lives and then suddenly something happens and maybe the double life becomes one life. And he says, you know, maybe that when that happens, it'll be for the worse, maybe it'll be for the better, but all kinds of flags will go up that don't look like the flag we're accustomed to seeing. Maybe it's black, maybe it's red, I don't know. He's thinking about the time in 1776 when the colonists were believing in the king right up until July, but in the meantime, they were having doubts. They didn't even know they didn't like the monarchy. But one day they woke up and said, the hell with King George. And they ran ahead and they wrote the Declaration of Independence and it was read to the troops. And at that particular point, the Union Jack went down and the Stars and Stripes went up. And Murray Bookchin says, this is the way people actually change. People change unconsciously before they change consciously. They begin to float dreams. Daydreams are dangerous. Daydreams are pieces of imagination. They are bits of poetry. They are the balloons that fly up in history. That's what we'd like to do here. For those of you who don't know, Chuck Marohn is the president and co-founder of Strong Towns, which is a nationally recognized nonprofit media organization working to shape the conversation on growth, development, and the future of cities. A good friend and looking forward to what you have to say. Chuck, go ahead.
Thank you, Elias. It's very nice to be here with both you and Russell. And I've appreciated over time the way the two of you have both, with gentleness and kindness and understanding, nudged me in certain directions. I think it was a few years ago you said something about, you know, just hey, you're a Catholic. Go ahead and lean into that a little bit. And it's funny because I think my natural tendency is to doubt my own inclinations, to challenge myself and my thinking first. And there's always been this sense of, you know, I think ultimately I do have a somewhat utopian vision for how the world should be and should operate. But I try not to lead with that because I feel, you know, and maybe it's the engineer part of me, maybe it's the Minnesotan part of me. I feel like there's this pragmatic side that needs to lead. What you asked me to talk about is what I think the next city is going to look like. And I actually have given a presentation for years called Transportation in the Next American City. I spent a lot of time thinking about what the next American city is going to look like and be like. And I'm going to show one slide here. I don't want to lean too much into slides today, but I want to show one because I think that my vision for what comes next, or my sense of what comes next, is created by these binding constraints, first of all, and then a kind of challenge for what path do we take after that. So I'm going to start with the binding constraints, and I'm going to share my screen here just briefly to show this slide, which if you followed Strong Towns for any length of time, you've seen this image here. This is a map of Lafayette, Louisiana. I was part of a large study that was done in Lafayette, Louisiana, along with a friend of mine named Joe Minicozy and his firm at Urban 3. They do these maps, they put maps together. And what we did in this study is we were trying to answer the question, why is a city broke? Why does a city have no money? Why is this a city that has grown, that has invested, that has done everything they could to try to create jobs and growth and prosperity, and every way we've kind of measured success today, they have pursued. Yet that success has remained elusive for the people who have seemingly been falling behind, elusive for the community. When we look at, the community itself, it has large swaths that have struggled and struggled for the institutions. We can start with the city government itself, and we can go down through the long list of social and civic institutions within the community and see them all struggling financially, all struggling with purpose and direction and relevance. What we did is we measured from the public's balance sheet of the community all of the ongoing expenses that the city had. We looked at where all the streets were, how much they cost to maintain, the sidewalks, the drainage systems, where they're providing police protection, fire protection. And then we looked at every source of revenue, collective revenue that the community was sending to the city, to this collective body designed to manage this area, where all that revenue was coming from. So we looked at all the property tax and the sales tax and the permit fees and the ongoing utility revenue. And we mashed we put a bunch of maps together to show all this spatially, and then we mashed them all together into this map. This is the culmination of about 18 months of work in Lafayette, Louisiana. What you're looking at here is a profit and loss map. Every place where you see blue is a parcel that on an annual basis pays more into the community. I always look at the city as like the collective way we take action. So if we look at this collective way we take action, the city, here's what everyone's contributing on an annual basis, minus the amount that it costs to provide ongoing service. So everywhere you see blue property is a parcel that is paying more every year than they require in ongoing service and maintenance. And the higher that line goes, the more the disparity is. Every place where you see red is the exact opposite. These are places that require more over the long term to provide service and maintenance to than they're actually paying annually in taxes and fees and other revenue. Let's break this down a little bit spatially. That blue part in the very middle, where you got the big spike and all that, that's the core downtown of Lafayette, Louisiana. That to the right of that, or to the east of that, there's a crescent of blue that runs through there. You can see it's kind of a crescent shaped blue. Those are the poorest neighborhoods in the community. I'm gonna put an image up here of what these places look like. The upper right is the core downtown. The bottom right is a representative sample of these poor neighborhoods. If you look at these, the core downtown does not pass like the eye test of what prosperity looks like. The bottom certainly does not look prosperous. It looks, very struggling. These neighborhoods do struggle a lot. They struggle to get tenants. They struggle to get people in. They struggle with vitality. If you want to go to some of these neighborhoods, you can hear some great Zydeco music. You can get a cheap taco and enjoy some good nightlife. But you will be in areas that are struggling and that people in the community would identify as struggling. Yet when we step back and we look at the cost to the community, we look at where their wealth is, where their cash flow goes. These are places that are profitable. And let me just be clear, when I say profitable in the community's eyes, this assumes that the community is actually out doing the work that they have agreed to do. When people pay taxes, they expect us to maintain the roads, they expect us to maintain the drainage systems, they expect us to maintain the pipes, keep the streetlights on, do all that. Obviously, the city's not doing that. The community is not providing those services. Assuming they were, these would be the most profitable neighborhoods in the community. These are places where they're collecting more revenue than it costs to provide that service. The fact that they're not providing that service means that they're making even more revenue than what we're showing in our map. What are all those red areas then? Those are areas that we've come to look at as growth. These are the areas that contain the malls, the strip malls, the big box stores, the franchise drive-through restaurants, the gas stations, the windy cul-de-sac streets, the big houses with the 3-car garages. That's all that area in red. If you look at the city of Lafayette, Louisiana, The median family sends $1,500 a year in taxes and fees to the city. In order for the city to maintain everything that they have promised, in order for that community to make good on providing that police and fire protection everywhere, fixing all the streets, maintaining all the pipes, keeping the parks in good maintenance, fixing all the public buildings. In order for the city to do that, the taxes from the median family would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. One out of every $5 that a family in Lafayette makes would need to get sent back to the local government to maintain the stuff that has already been built. That's not going to happen. And that's never, ever, it's not possible that would happen. It won't happen. And so at some point, the city of Lafayette, and they're already well into this process, is going to have to make a decision. What neighborhoods do we keep? What neighborhoods do we let go? What roads do we fix? What roads do we walk away from? What places do we take care of? What places do we allow to fall apart? When we get to the question of what the next city is going to look like, I think the very first thing that we have to come to grips with is that it's going to be, and I'm going to use the word poorer, but when I say poorer, I'm only talking about it in terms of immediate finance. They're going to be cash poor, okay? And the ramification of that is that the next city, the next version of American city, is not going to be able to throw money at their problems and expect that to be a solution. Let me give you a very crystal example of this. For many, many centuries, when we look at human settlements, we understand that one of the reasons that humans come together in cities is for security. It's a very base need. We look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and people need to feel secure in their place and in their premises. If we look at the structure of cities, and we can even go back and look at the structure of more nomadic peoples, what we see is that when they set up settlements, they set them up often in configurations that provide a base amount of security. People are able to, in a classic sense, in a Jane Jacobs sense, line up their streets so that you can look out your front door, you can look out your front window and see the public realm. Anyone in the public realm is going to be viewable to everybody in a passive kind of way. This has a very kind of subtle way of increasing the security of the place. The more eyes that are on it, in a sense, the more secure it becomes, even if those are not active eyes, even if those are passive eyes. And so we look at human settlements, and what we see is that they often have these configurations where houses open onto a public area. That public area is viewable by all. The approach to everyone's private abode or private place is through that public realm. And this provides a base level of security. In the 20th century and in modern American development and in our really what I think should be thought of as our affluence, what we've been able to say is that, you know what, we don't have to worry about that anymore. What we can do, because we have lots of money, is we can hire a lot of police officers. We can have them patrol the streets and keep an eye out for people. We can, there's multiple Elias Crims, and they all look different now.
Okay, I know what that is.
I'm muting people as they come in here.
Right. That's fine.
We're good. You look, and what we have done is we've essentially, thrown money at the problem of security. Now we are to the point where, well, wealthy people can have their own home security system. We can hire companies to monitor our homes, and we'll put security cameras on them. We'll have public security cameras. We will, if you're very wealthy, hire your own security force and your own security service. And so what we have done is we have taken something that in the past was a collective thing we all did at a passive level very cheaply and very effectively. And we have put that into something that now is very expensive, very costly, and far, far less effective. Once we get to the point where, and we did this, understand, because now you don't have to have the public realm. You don't have to have that interaction. You can actually face your house away from the street. You can more like privatize your life. You can, in a sense, wall yourself off from everyone else, which was the great promise of the suburbs and the great promise of American development, the great promise really of affluence. As we become less affluent, what we discover is that not only in the area of policing, but in multiple dimensions of society, throwing money at our problems is no longer an option. And I think in many ways, my hope is we'll discover it was never even the best option to begin with. I think that there are going to be two diverging paths for the next city. And this is probably what concerns me most about America today. It's not the transition we're going through. For a decade or more now, we've been talking about how fragile our communities are, how economic systems that promote transactions and GDP over wealth creation and stability are destined to fall apart. In some ways, there's been the earlier we do this transition, the better sense for strong towns, which I think puts us in an awkward position today of cheering for, economic transition when I think, a lot of people are hurting, and it's been a fine line to walk where we're like, okay, we've got to do this. Let's get through it. We can do it while still acknowledging that this is a difficult transition that is hurting and harming many people. But when I look through to the other side of it, I see two diverging paths. And the concern that I have and the effort that we have today is to try to help as many communities as we can get on the successful path. Let me define these two paths. I think one path is a path where either by default, because they have it and it has not been eroded, or because the systems and the institutions create it, there is a broad localized civic society that is there right now in place or constructed that will serve as the glue, the binding that will pull the community together. When you read Alienated America, Tim Carney's recent book, and we had him on our podcast to discuss this at length, he drew very strong correlations between cities that have strong civic bonds, strong civic society. And by the way, these can be civic bonds that are left of center or right of center or cross over, whatever political construct you want to kind of foist on America today. This is not a political statement as much as it is a statement of civic society. When you have high civic engagement, when you have trusted institutions within a community, institutions of government, institutions of law, institutions of church and faith and community and nonprofits, when you have these institutions in place, what you have are things that are capable of adapting and responding to emergencies and stress and nudging a community towards reinventing itself and higher planes of existence, in a sense. The opposite, and in Carney's book, he took an interesting look at this and correlated it with the Trump voter experience in the Republican primary. And not necessarily that these were Trump districts in general, and not necessarily that this is all correlated with the Trump phenomena, but as a way to measure a feeling of connectedness with others, a feeling of empowerment by the community versus a feeling of desperation and isolation and pessimism about the future. It was strongly correlated with where Donald Trump did very well in the 2016 primaries. Where he did well, these tended to be places of greater social isolation, higher levels of not just unemployment, but persistent unemployment. Places that seem to be, to use a medical term, failing to thrive. In those places, what we see a lot of is that the civic institutions that glue binding the community together is often absent, or where it's not absent, deeply, deeply repressed. These are places that struggle in many ways. I found a lot of hope in Chris Arnotti's book, and particularly in Arnotti's book, Dignity. And again, another person we've had on our podcast to discuss this. I recommend you listen to that if you haven't had a chance. In Dignity, one of the things that I took a lot of hope in is the way Chris had his own personal transformation about the role of religious institutions. As someone who, in his own way said, I'm not religious, I'm not practicing religion in any way, but when I'm out in these communities, I do. Essentially acknowledging not only the deeper meaning that is provided with these interactions, but also the way that institutions like this, mediating institutions, create that glue, that civil society, that set of nudges, in a sense, that allow people to get out of or to handle stress and adversity and actually, grow to a higher level of being. When we strip out the finances and we look at cities the way they are today, this fragile construct with tons of liabilities and not much wealth. When we look at just the basic math equation, what we see is that we are going to have to do much, much more with much, much less. We're going to have to figure out how to feed people, how to get people shelter, how to maintain basic essential infrastructure systems, how to have community dialogues of not one where we're splitting a growing pie, but one where we're talking about how do we morally deal with a pie that is much less than what we perceived it was. One in which individual homeowners are seeing their own property values decline, their own job prospects decline in many ways. All of these stresses coming to bear, to me, signify that the places that are going to be most set up to adapt, thrive, find ways to do much, much more with much, much less are the ones that have this glue of the mediating institutions, the glue of a strong civic society. And the ones that I think will struggle are the ones whose gut inclination is to say, we cannot do this for ourselves. What can the state do for us? We cannot do this for themselves. What will the federal government be able to do for us? We cannot do this for ourselves. What corporation can we get to come in and help us out in this state? I have talked to many, many public officials over the last month. And the ones that talk to me about what can I do? What can we do? What can we set up and establish or provide room for here in our communities? To me, those leaders are deeply inspiring. The people who are getting out now today and walking around their communities, the people who have redirected their staff to actually engage with people and say, where are people struggling? Where are the people in my community having a difficult time? Those, to me, are the exciting leaders, the ones that I think are really positioning themselves and their communities to not only weather this storm as effectively as they can, but be in a position to adapt and recover with some vigor. The ones that I've spoke to that make me the saddest are the ones that say, hey, are you aware of any programs we can tap into? Are you aware of any place we can go for support? Are you aware of, any pots of money that we've not pondered? How do we give money away to our businesses to try to keep them afloat now today? These make me sad, not because I don't think there should be any assistance. I'm working on a piece right now trying to convince the Congress and just our national narrative to not launder assistance for cities through an infrastructure program, but just give them cash. I think cities would do a lot right now today with cash as opposed to money to build more infrastructure. So I do think that money can help, but I think if our gut reaction at the local level is not to see the beauty and the potential and all the things around us that are really, I think, well positioned to beautifully adapt to this change, If we're looking elsewhere, if we're looking beyond, we're missing a lot of opportunity. And so my advice to people and my interactions with these local leaders has been to try to get them redirected. Instead of looking at their city as kind of the bottom of a food chain of local governments, to look at their community as essentially a servant of the people that live in this place. Instead of orienting themselves up a food chain saying, you know, what scraps are going to trickle down, obsessively focusing on the needs of people in their community and how do we address them with the tools we have. And so if something comes in, we've got the right orientation. We're already focused on the problem and we can mobilize those resources for that. If we focus on the hierarchy, what we do is we miss all the opportunities to actually be of service and benefit the people in our communities and move things forward in a productive way. I think we all need to remember that, you know, even in the depths of depression in this country, you had, you know, 3/4 of people who were working age, who wanted a job, had a job and were working. You had cities that continued to move forward and see adaptation and change. Even in our poorest condition as a country, we are still going to be the wealthiest country in the world. We're still going to be like the wealthiest place with the wealthiest people. We have all the resources we need to build and transform our cities into being very productive, very livable, very prosperous places where that prosperity is broadly shared amongst many, many people in a very bottom-up way. This is our opportunity not to despair, but to actually transition into something that I think will better serve us as humans and set us up for decades and decades of true prosperity, as opposed to kind of the transactional, consumptive way we've come to measure growth and success in our society over the last number of decades. So with that, I am going to pause. I think Russell has some things to add and to say.
Yeah, Russell, why don't you come in and give yourself an introduction, if you will.
Hi, I'm really pleased to have been asked to respond and maybe, you know, throw a few additional things out in relation to the presentation that Chuck just gave us. I really appreciate what Elias and others have done to try to bring together a lot of socially concerned people, you know, whether their motivation is faith-based or very fiscally based. There's a lot of conversations taking place about breakdowns within our socioeconomic systems and within our expectations for one another. And it's important to, you know, bring in voices like the Strongtown voice to think about what we can do in response to all that. So one of the things that I really liked about what you just presented, Chuck, was the fact that those people like yourself and Elias and others and all sorts of different people that are engaged in some form of critique of the situation that we're in today, you recognize that it's kind of a delicate situation. You know, I think, as you put it, you know, it's kind of hard to cheer for economic transition at a time when, you know, there's a lot of economic suffering going on. And I think it's really appropriate to put that difficulty front and center, because I don't think we can avoid it. I think it haunts a lot of what you've presented just here. It haunts a lot of what you have presented through all sorts of different Strongtown initiatives over the years. It haunts a lot of the thinking, the very ordinary thinking that a lot of us have, which is simply, have things gotten bad enough for it to really be likely that people will want to try something different? You wrote a wonderful piece that appeared on the Strongtown's website just a little while ago, titled The End of the Suburban Experiment. And I believe Elias linked to that as something that would be helpful for people who are coming to this webinar to maybe understand a little bit about the Strongtown message. Well, we all understand the problems with the suburban experiment. And the suburban experiment is a shorthand way of talking about this whole process of debt-driven growth as opposed to, concentrated wealth creation through communities over time, okay? It's this expansion mentality, the idea of bringing in sources of funding, whether they be corporate or government, in order to provide new and shinier services to city dwellers without actually addressing the fundamentals. We see this all around ourselves. In my city of Wichita, there's dozens, hundreds of examples of this we could give. Things as basic as the city confronting the fact that it doesn't have the money to maintain the paint on crosswalks. And so they have to engage in this rationing to figure out, which crosswalks are we actually going to repaint so they can still be seen by pedestrians. That kind of fundamental stuff gets pushed aside. I mean, not that there aren't a lot of people who are very seriously thinking about it. There are, and some of them are, listening to this webinar right now. But it gets pushed aside conceptually because we're always looking for these opportunities of growth. And the suburban experiment is a way to just kind of describe that whole approach. Well, in your essay, Chuck, when you talked about the end of the suburban experiment, as I read it, you basically came up with two reasons why we can be pretty certain that it's not going to continue, that we are approaching the end of it. One is that we're broke, okay? Your argument was the financial resources just aren't going to be there. Maybe you will have the occasional independently wealthy individuals that will want to construct for themselves suburban-like compounds, outside of the cities. But basically, individuals and cities and states and the country as a whole just aren't going to have the resources to deal with these massive liabilities, to deal with these massive costs. It's just going to be too expensive. Okay, so that was one argument. The other argument was, in a time of transition, when we're all sheltering at home and we're walking the dog and we're adopting to a necessarily much slower pace of life, we're going to appreciate the fact that there are all sorts of virtues, there are all sorts of opportunities, there are all sorts of very, very humble pleasures that are available to us in our neighborhoods, in our own local dense connections. And consequently, we're not going to want to engage in the suburban experiment in the future. We're going to see the alternative and we're going to choose otherwise. Okay, so not to load too much emphasis on that one piece of yours, but I think it's a fair analytic. There's the argument that we're just going to go broke and we're going to have to do something different. And there's the argument that we're going to realize something different and we're going to choose to do something different. I think it's interesting to parallel that with the two options that you just laid out. You're going to have the cities that have a localized civil society, that have these strong bonds. I just read a really fine book called Cities on the Hill that talked about what it called institutions of horizontal integration. But it's really the same sort of thing. It's the ability of people to feel confident enough and trusted enough within local networks that they're going to choose to do something different. They're going to choose to adapt and make use of alternative resources to move in a different direction. And these are the sorts of people that presumably are going to recognize the opportunities that this terrible pandemic has presented to us, and they're going to start trying to build something alternative. And then the other option you mentioned, the other type of city, are the people who can only see that they're broke and can only think about how can we possibly prop up this system? Where can we find the pot of money that will enable us to prop up this system? This reminds me of the work of a scholar named David Imbrasio. He's a political scientist, studies urban issues at the University of Louisville. And he has a great argument in regards to what he calls liberal expansionism. And you don't want to emphasize too much, the ideological content of the term that he uses. He's not trying to make some sort of grand political or philosophical argument. When he says liberal expansionism, he's simply talking about how within cities, because people have come there, because they're looking for individual opportunities of transformation and growth, when they don't see it, city leaders are going to try to expand their reach to enable them to enjoy it. So they're always going to be expanding in terms of looking for new businesses that can move to town, in terms of constructing new housing developments that they could move into and that will employ people along the way, and that this becomes a self-perpetuating manner. I wish I could be confident that there was a lot of option one cities out there. I fear that there's going to be a lot more option two cities out there. And this becomes really important to me in that my own focus of interest are, cities like Wichita, not the huge driving economic urban agglomerations of the country, but still good-sized cities, often cities that are in the middle of the country or the western part of the country, cities that have a fair amount of sprawl, that are very automobile dependent. And I can see people around me, and I'm sure you in Minnesota and other people listening to this webinar can find their own examples as well. I can hear people around me saying, well, this is terrible, obviously. But if you notice that gas is now only $1.29 a gallon, oh my gosh, and I'm fearful that the intricacies of our economy are such that economic downturns and difficult transitions are going to send signals that will allow people to convince themselves that, well, no, rethinking isn't necessary, because look at what I can do with, with my car now. I mean, we talk about how there's less traffic on the streets and how now we can hear the birds and it's a little more safe to go, taking a walk. And that can lead us in the option one direction, the rethinking direction. But, also, again, speaking of my own city, there's been a bit of a revival in dragging down main streets and people getting out there and, just, putting the pedal to the metal within their automobiles because, the streets are a little bit more open and gas is certainly a lot cheaper. So I don't know. I struggle with trying to figure out how we can identify kind of the right signaling, the right sort of signaling in the midst of this very difficult and for many people quite desperate moment, as opposed to allowing contrary signaling to take over. And I don't have an answer to that. I just recognize that as you lay out these options, I can recognize, and I would suspect that most of the people who bothered to show up for a webinar like this can also recognize that there are real opportunities present for us to come to reappreciate density and organic growth and all of the rest of it. But when you have people who are used to this kind of liberal expansion model, and when they see certain sorts of signals out there, like gas that's only $1.29 a gallon, they might take this moment of transition in a very, from our point of view, less productive and less helpful direction. And I don't know how best to do the nudging that's necessary there, but I think that's something that we've got to be conscious of. All right, so there are some thoughts, Elias. Hopefully that added something that's helpful.
That's a fascinating analysis. It's really interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking about the movie Mad Max, which I just watched, like the newest incarnation. Yeah. And I think one of the things that like struck me about Mad Max is like the very new one, which is a great movie, by the way. It's a ton of fun. But the idea that like the whole world is falling apart. You're reduced to like one oasis where you have a little bit of water and a little bit of food. And somehow they would decide to spend the last bit of petroleum they have on these massive vehicles and massive, like,
Right.
there is something like, I think, you know, you watch that and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense, but there is something like human about, okay, well, this is like the guilty pleasure I've got. So I'm going to drag down Main Street. I do think that part of what I look at as our mission, and part of what I think that we can collectively do, is to communicate the quality of life and the inherent answer that a more organic growth approach, a more localized growth approach, real neighborhoods, less about transactions, more about that stability, would be for people. Because I do think that the interesting thing to note about the option 1 and the option 2 communities is not so much that, you know, like there will be a difference, because there will be, but that they both could be if they chose option 1 places. Like there is no place that actually lacks the resources or the capacity to do it. It's a cultural choice on which path you want to go down. And I think that puts the burden on us to communicate this in a different way if we want to help more people reach that better place.
And that's where local knowledge, that really ground level tactile knowledge becomes so crucial, because I don't disagree with you that any community could be an option 1 community, but obviously some communities are going to find it harder than others. I mean, that's part of your whole point.
Right.
And so it's necessary for us to be aware of what's going on the ground and figure out where pressure can be put, where ideas can be put forward, you know, to move the particular community that we're in. Okay, so I don't mean to make this all about my city, but like one of the things that a city like Wichita has going for it is that it really wouldn't take an enormous amount of effort to make some major changes in our food system, because we have a lot of farmland right by us. Other cities, you know, they might have to look at other ways to do the nudging that's necessary. I mean, you're not going to get a full option 1 or a full option 2. Well, actually, you probably will get a lot of full option 2s.
You may, yeah.
But a full option 1 is never going to happen overnight. You got to figure out how to build it within your place.
Right. To bring more people along. And I think when you look at Wichita, not only is there plenty of place to build food, to grow food, there's plenty of people who need jobs, who are ready to do that work, you know, if they can make a decent living doing it. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a capacity to reimagine and reconstruct local economies there in a way that, yes, wouldn't maybe measure as well on GDP statistics at the federal level, but actually would provide people with meaningful lives, you know, lives of purpose and intention that actually are stable and prosperous in ways that I think people would gravitate to right now. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to note that, to me, the discerning thing between what we've now kind of slid into calling option 1 and option 2 kind of places is not the level of affluence. It's not, you know, how wealthy you are or how poor you are, or, you know, can you access capital or not. I think it has a lot more to do with, you know, the local narrative and the local conversation and how people see themselves and their future and their communities. You know, the big takeaway from that Lafayette map is that the poor neighborhoods are subsidizing the wealthy neighborhoods. Once you grasp that, and once you grasp that that is kind of a ubiquitous condition of North American cities, it should change everything about how you view what our public investments should look like, how our local government should be designed, how our civic institutions fit in with that. It really challenges every narrative we have had imposed on us or have culturally adopted about how growth, investment equals jobs equals prosperity. That equation goes away.
Mm-hmm.
Chuck, I wanted to throw a question at, well, actually both you guys, moving the scale up from the city level, maybe to the regional level. I noticed that a few weeks ago, I'm sure you guys spotted it too, Governor Newsom was organizing some Western states in the scramble to find PPE and other necessary items for the crisis. Governor Cuomo was doing the same thing in the Northeast. And in the Midwest, Governor Pritzker rounded up 3 or 4 regional governors, and they began to operate in a somewhat independent way. They started making this move toward a kind of a regional understanding of what had to happen. What are your thoughts on the way in which city to city kinds of collaboration in a kind of a regional sense might become a piece of this in a way that we haven't experienced in a long time?
Let me take that first, Russell, and then I think, I welcome whatever. I'm very reflexively negative on regionalism, and I'll tell you why. And I'll tell you why this is the example you pointed out is different. So let me tell you why I've been reflexively not for regionalism. And whenever people talk about regional action, I've always had this bad reaction to it. Essentially, what regionalism has come to mean today is binding together in order to access outside capital flows. If my city and your city can join together, we can get a bigger government grant. If my city and your city can join together, we can access, this capital market that we otherwise couldn't. It's been about quantities of scale to try to compete in a vertical system. Mm-hmm. The way you're describing regionalism, 5 states coming together to try to get PPE and share them across state boundaries to go at hot spots, because recognizing a virus doesn't stop at state boundaries, it transfers back and forth. And so if we can isolate something here in a neighboring state, it benefits me here. So let me help you do that. Those things are horizontal collaborations. And I think horizontal collaborations are fantastic. When it's a coming together in order to be a bigger player in a vertical system, I think you lose a lot of the, let me give you the prime example that I see so often. One city has a school, another city has a school. They both need maintenance. They both need upkeep. They're both struggling to do that. And so what does the state of Minnesota encourage them to do? What you should do is you should consolidate together into one bigger district. And then you can have one superintendent and one librarian and one lunch lady. And you don't have to have dual systems and you can operate so much cheaper. And they're like, wow, that sounds great. That would be wonderful. And then the state says, you know what, if you do that, we'll give you a little bit more money than we otherwise would. And wow, this is awesome. And then the end result is they build a school halfway between their 2 cities, walk away from both of the neighborhood schools, and essentially transfer the cost of that saved to people who now not only lose the school in their community, but now have to interact with a school that's many, many distance, away from where they're at. It's a transferring of costs from in a sense the vertical system to horizontal individuals and small businesses. What I like is the collaboration that is purely horizontal. And if we can focus on those types, I think we can start to see good regional cooperation. I think the vertical is the distorting part.
Yeah. The only thing that I would add to that is that I'm not sure you can ever take vertical considerations entirely out of the question. I mean, any kind of, horizontal connection, unless there is literally only one level in the entire social structure you're part of, there's going to be a vertical consideration. Subsidiarity is a thing, okay? But I agree with Chuck that an awful lot of the time, when people talk about, increased efficiency or, more effective returns, what they're mostly talking about is, being a stronger player in, some kind of vertical game, whether that be, in terms of attracting a business or attracting a grant or something like that. Regionalism, in what Elias is talking about, it's had an interesting history in American life, not a particularly strong one. It's not that, the constitutional structures aren't there. You can talk about, state compacts and things like that, but just informally, there are some, really notable examples. You can take a look at the way, historically, like Virginia and Maryland and Delaware have managed the Chesapeake Bay and other examples like that. But there is, Chuck's warnings, I think, are really on point. I think it is often the case that when you see certain sorts of regionalist type talk, you're not necessarily talking about, people trying to create a sharing economy between different polities. You have people who are thinking in terms of positioning themselves.
Right. Right. That's how I would describe it too. And I think when you're grounded, what we try to talk to local leaders, inside and outside of government, is when you're grounded horizontally in that there are grants that are good. There are partnerships that are good. There are vertical relationships that are helpful. I think the subsidiarity reference is really point on, but they only work when you're grounded in the horizontal. They don't work when you're oriented. The one that I'm dealing with right now, and maybe it'll go away. I haven't really pondered it for a few weeks. It might go away now with the coronavirus. The big obsession in my community over the last 6 months has been, we're going to get a children's museum. Why are we going to get a children's museum? Not because there was a huge outcry from the bottom up for a children's museum, not because we went around to neighborhoods and really tried to understand where people were struggling and where the depths of the struggles were, and came up with the idea that a children's museum would best address those struggles. The reason we're going to get a children's museum is because there's a grant at the state to do children's museums. There's a regional organization that has a budget that will get some money, some of that money for facilitating that transaction. And so all of a sudden now you have someone who's being paid to find a location for a children's museum. And that's taken lots of our staff time, lots of our budget, dominate our city council meetings. We're going to have to come up with local money to do it. And maybe it's a good idea. I'm not even going to argue that we shouldn't have a children's museum, but I'm going to argue that the inception of it did not come from an identified horizontal need. It's not the most urgent need that came out of a horizontal conversation. The horizontal conversation does not exist the way it should. If it did and it produced the need for a children's museum, great. There's a grant for it. Let's go do it. But it's that lack of the horizontal that really, I think, makes the regionalism a problematic undertaking.
I really like how you said that, Chuck, that, if the horizontal was there and the grant was there or the government program was there, then go for it. But
go for it.
If you're bypassing the horizontal simply because of the grant or the government project or, the temptation from Amazon or, something like that, then you're skipping an essential step. Earlier, you had talked about, the way the federal government will tie aid to various sorts of infrastructure projects as opposed to simply giving money, which then groups could use horizontally in different ways.
Right.
I think that we could kind of come up with a a general thesis here, which is to go back to like the option 1, option 2. If you have option 1, then go ahead and pursue option 2, please.
Right.
Do so.
Yeah.
If you don't have option 1, then there's going to be some real downsides to putting all your eggs on option 2.
Well, not only that, but I think like the difficult thing for the internal conversation is that all of a sudden now we have the leaders in our community putting the struggles of poor and disadvantaged and dislocated and unemployed people in terms of being fulfilled through a children's museum, as opposed to, actually being in touch with those struggles and then identifying actions that would address them. So it allows us to, I think in a Catholic tradition, we would say, it allows us to feel like we've gone to confessional without actually dealing with our sins, right? We've been able to, do something that we can kind of frame and talk about as in, an act of contrition without actually feeling contrite.
Right.
I like how, Chuck and Elias were both, oh yeah, with that. And I was like, yeah, I've read about that.
Virtue signaling. It's called.
Virtue signaling, right. And it becomes statecraft. And I think that is, it's a difficult thing to talk about because just like, we Russell, you mentioned earlier too, we don't want to skip over the difficulty. Virtue signaling is one. The virtue is actually important. Signaling the virtue is, maybe like a step in the right direction, but like you've got to, follow through. And I think sometimes these vertical systems allow us to bypass. If you're in Lafayette, Louisiana, and you recognize, and I mean, this is really every city, but you recognize that like your most financially productive, profitable neighborhoods are the poorest neighborhoods where people are deeply struggling, and you have for decades neglected those places with just like the bare essentials of public service, that should have a profound effect on you. And the kind of effect it should have on you is not the kind where you say, well, let's create a program or find a grant that will maybe help people. It should be to go out and humble yourself to actually say, like, I don't understand the needs here. I don't understand what's going on. Let me try to be a more humble person and grasp like what is actually going on here.
Well said.
Chuck, can you see any questions in the chat you want to pick up, or anybody you want to identify?
Somebody did ask you to restate something. Somebody in the chat asked you to restate something that you had said, Chuck.
Yeah, I see that. If people want to ask questions, the chat will be like a stream, but if you want to go to the Q&A and type your question in, it will show up as an actual question we can answer. Someone said, can you type out, something, those that prioritize blank over blank are doomed to fail. I don't remember what I said, but I think in general, oh, thanks, Gryffindor. My dog is in here with me. He's decided to wake up now. I think, in general, those that prioritize transactions, growth, the process, the system, over wealth creation, stability, human needs, actual human interaction. I think, those are the places that are doomed to fail. And I would say that maybe a little bit in the opposite way too, which is if we ground ourselves in a broader based approach, if we ground ourselves in our neighborhoods and in the people who live there and their needs, and we allow that to guide our actions, we will end up in really productive places. We'll end up in really good, healthy communities that are financially prosperous and are stable, and create a lot of opportunity for people.
I'm responding right now to somebody in the chat who talked about how suburbanization was kind of an exercise in wealth distribution. And I mean, the way in which wealth was moved out into those areas was at least partly a consequence of the lack of broad and equitable public control of local government. And that makes me think about how much of that control was fiscal. Cities aren't in control of their own finances to a certain degree. And I think it might be worth maybe spending a little bit of time, talking about that. I mean, when you have cities that for decades have kind of operated, I mean, some cities have been able to avoid this to a certain degree. And partly it's related to the option one thing that you talked about, Chuck, the cities that really had a robust civil society, there was real trust amongst different constituencies, and so they could take collective actions together. But, an awful lot of cities, partly as a result of suburbanization, their citizens have been spread out, that kind of trust has disappeared. And so they've just accommodated themselves to this idea that, we depend upon grants. We depend upon the state government. We depend upon the federal government. We're here to administer somebody else's policies.
Right.
We're not really financially, masters of our own domain. How do we begin to unpack that, Chuck?
Let me take it a step further. Because I think that's actually an even later consequence of earlier decisions. So I think we can all grasp that growth in and of itself helps us solve immediate problems. If we can just grow whatever we're growing and use that prosperity from that immediate growth to go out and solve problems, it's a very seductive A plus B equals C kind of equation. Particularly when you can ignore the long-term financial consequences of it. So I think it should be no surprise to anyone that this is an easy kind of trap to fall into. I want to highlight something I highlighted in chapter 5 of my book, which is how we responded after the first generation of suburban expansion. When things started to get difficult, when bills started to come due. And I'll use Minnesota here as an example. We went through something called the Minnesota Miracle. And the Minnesota Miracle, when you talk about the broad and equitable local control, what we did in the name of efficiency is we went to every local government and we said, that little rule you've got over here, can't have that. That tax you've got here, nope, can't have that. That licensing process you've got, that goes away. And what we're going to do is we're going to have one statewide system of taxation that will apply in every community everywhere. And the state will collect all the money, and then we will return that to cities with a formula. And that formula will allow us to be very generous and redistributive and have all these positive effects. And it will be great. And oh, by the way, it will be very efficient for businesses who want to grow. And the reality is all that came to pass. All that was very true. And so every little city gave up their local control and the state collected all the money. And now when McDonald's wanted to expand or Walmart wanted to expand, they didn't have to go to every city hall and work out all the local rules and nuances. They didn't have to figure out the marketplace and how everything worked in every city. They could just go in with their formula, set up shop, and move on to the next place, the next place, the next place. And it created massive amounts of growth, very, very quickly. The problem is now you have a city like mine, which is an old mill town with an old railroad, both of which now are very diminished, themselves, surrounded by tourist area. We have the same exact tax structure as Minneapolis, St. Paul, major metropolitan areas, as second and third ring suburbs, as agricultural areas in the west side of the state, as the mining areas in the northern side of the state. All of a sudden, we have the same exact incentives, the same exact structure, whether our economy is ag or extraction or service or manufacturing, we all have the same approach. What you've lost is you've lost all the local nuance. You've lost all the capacity of local leadership and local communities. When I talk of leadership, I'm not just talking the mayor and city council. I'm talking about all the people within the community that contribute to this ongoing cultural dialogue, we've lost all of our ability to fine tune our systems to fit us. And so if you're a city up on the Iron Range and you have millions of dollars, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of ore flowing through your city every year, you have a property tax the same exact way that that third ring suburb of Minneapolis, St. Paul is funded by a property tax. The same way that, you know, the small town of Brainerd, Minnesota, where I live, is funded by a property tax. And so you wind up with this massively distorted system that has lost all local nuance. When we talk about creating, you know, the capacity of local officials to respond, what we're really talking about is giving them their agency back, giving them their ability to adapt to their own unique local conditions. That's so hard for us because the first thing that will happen is that, you know, Wells Fargo or someone will come in and say, oh my gosh, if we got to deal with every little small town parochial thing, we're never going to get anything done. Well, guess what? People used to get food. They used to build homes. They used to do all these things in you know, a system that was much less efficient. I think recognizing what we've done and how we've really gutted our cities and turned them into just merely implementation tools of macro policy is really important to start building back those systems of you know, civic infrastructure.
I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to do anything to undermine the localist argument because, you know, it's a true argument. But I mean, we have to recognize that there's trade-offs in everything. And,
absolutely, yeah.
You know, the Wells Fargo example that you gave, you know, you're right. Cities were able to function and flourish in less efficient environments. But, you know, in the move from super efficiency to maybe a little bit more local inefficiency, you know, there will actually be some costs. And to the extent that, you know, people have kind of a consumer mindset and they're thinking to themselves, well, you know, actually all that matters to me is the bottom line, and will I be able to find the stuff, buy the stuff, do the stuff, you know, buy the home, you know, drive the car that I want to be able to drive. You know, anything that makes that more complicated or costly, I am against. So I'm just in favor of these kind of macro level things because I experience it as individually empowering. I think most people, especially, you know, when they get grounded in communities and they make friends and they have families, you know, they recognize the limitation of that approach to things. But I mean, that approach is going to be a constant, and it's going to be a pressure on those of us that, you know, want to, you know, wave the localist flag and say, you know, local inefficiency is not necessarily that much of a problem because, you know, there will be someone who says, you know, as you also mentioned in a recent piece on Strong Towns, they're going to say, but I just really, really want a cheesecake factory.
Right.
Why the hell can't we get a cheesecake factory? It's not that big of a deal.
Right.
Come on.
I'm glad you brought this up.
Yeah.
Because I think you're right. I think you're totally right. I do think that the transition we're in right now is going to actually change that underlying economics to where, you know, this is a little bit of me projecting, but if you look at the decisions we're making in a macro level, and you alluded to them a little bit earlier, Russell, it's hard to see how we emerge from this entire transition with both like low-cost gas, low-cost housing, low-cost food, people with jobs, people getting paid, you know, like the theory that we've had is that we can allow the middle class to decline, allow more and more people to be trapped in poverty and poor because we've driven down the price of goods cheap. So yes, Walmart comes to town and you may all lose your jobs, but you're going to get some type of government subsidy. And by the way, food will be really cheap now.
Exactly.
That's been the trade-off we've had.
Yep.
And to me, that's the thing that is like breaking right now. It's like all the ripple effects of that are breaking. And I think we get to, I hate to be like, cause I'm going to sound like I'm a gold bug or something. I feel like the easiest path to resolve a lot of the macro problems we have right now is going to be a bout of, and I'm not saying Weimar inflation, but a bout of inflation. And whether it's, 1970s style inflation where we've got double-digit inflation for 3-4 years and then milder periods of 5 or 6% inflation for a decade, something has to happen to correct the imbalances. And the way that decision makers and people in power and people who control these things would like to see that happen is through some type of inflationary period. Those kind of things are brutal on the poorest people. And I think that ultimately when you go through a transition like that, a lot of the, let's just say the wants and desires are repriced. And so our expectations of what should be and what is becomes different and changes. And actually, I think that is what is way out of whack. And I think that as painful as a transition will be and as difficult as I think it will be, I think one of the things we'll look back on is just how freaking exorbitant, wasteful lifestyles we used to live was. I want milk. I'm just going to get in my car and drive 4 miles and get a gallon of milk and come home. I mean, that would have been absurd. I think about like my grandparents who grew up during the Depression and saved their aluminum cans to recycle to get, 20 cents for bringing them in. I mean, they were so ridiculously frugal. And I'll say this with modesty, compared to my peers, I feel like I'm ridiculously frugal. Compared to my grandparents, I am like a free spending, profligate, wasteful individual. We have a lot of belt tightening that I think is going to be forced upon us.
And I like that, but it also takes us back to the original point I made in my response to your comments, which is, are we actually hoping that things get worse? We don't really want to do that. And yet this is the weirdness of this particular transition. I want to throw out something else, and this is related to somebody who just asked a question about density, which you have also talked about several times on the website in connection with the coronavirus. What is the kind of the best line? What do you think is the best line for somebody who recognizes these things and wants to promote these things, when they confront a hard scientific argument that says, yeah, but putting people close together means more infections and more deaths. So really, sprawl is best. I mean, I know the arguments against that, but it might be worthwhile to kind of lay them out here in the context of, how you message this, how you communicate the idea of, small, dense communities at a time when people might think, well, actually, the best thing is for us to move out to our McMansion and never leave.
It's very interesting because I've struggled with, I think, the urbanist knee-jerk reaction to this critique. The urbanist knee-jerk reaction has been, no, transit is fine. Everybody should get on the subway. And I'm like, really? Because even if like you could somehow make a scientific argument that that's true, no one's going to buy that. Like no one, you look at people's behavior, and I know people who are diehard urbanists who are taking cars now because they won't ride a bus, because they don't want to be in an enclosed place. Why are we telling people that riding on a plane is dangerous, that you have to wear a face mask, but getting on a bus or a subway is not? So I do think that, if urban advocates want to pretend that this is not an issue, I think they lose credibility. The way that we've approached this, I think, is to look at the structure of places. If you're Joel Kotkin, whoever you are, who's arguing that, well, everyone's going to want to live in the suburb. Okay, fine. Where are they going to get their food? Well, they're going to get their food by going to a big box grocery store. A big box grocery store is like a point of concentration of density. Everybody in my community, I drove out to my parents' house because we have a garden out there. So I drove out this weekend to work in the garden. And when I was on my way out there, it's 4 miles from here, I had to drive by Home Depot, and I actually pulled into the parking lot because I wanted to see for myself, because I had heard rumors, and the rumors were true. Parking lot was packed. There's people everywhere. They're going in and out. Home Depot is like a concentration point. Thousands of people went through the same pair of doors that lots of other infected people went through. Yes, the doors open automatically, but like they got the same carts, the same aisles, the same place. They're in the same place. The Suburban Experiment, the way we built our places, has this full pretend, this veneer of isolation, because you can be in your own house. But the actual structure of it requires you to quite frequently and periodically go to places of high concentration. This is the opposite of what a neighborhood is. A neighborhood is actually a place where you're in relatively isolated position, but relatively close contact with people continuously. You have your own house. Your house has its own entrance. You can go to the corner store. You don't have, 8,000 people from the community going there. You have 200 people from the neighborhood going there. If the neighboring neighborhood starts to get infection, you can actually close off that entity and your neighborhood doesn't die. If your community starts to get infection now, we all still have to go to the same grocery store. We all still have to go to the same Home Depot. There's no way to, in a sense, isolate a virus in our current configuration. And so when we look at neighborhoods, we have to understand that humans have gone through periodic waves of viral infection. And cities have actually adapted a neighborhood structure, in a sense, to deal with this type of transmission. You can cut off and isolate one neighborhood from others. That neighborhood will still continue to function internally, even though there's a viral spread. It can be isolated from another neighborhood that itself will operate independently. And when things have cleared up, you can reconnect the two and go back to the way you were. This is very different than our vacillating between places of immense isolation and places of immense concentration, which is what suburban development patterns are today. And so to me, the whole, density argument is, when you deny it because you love cities, you're, I think, losing credibility. But when you pretend it doesn't exist in suburbs, just in a different form, you're actually denying reality just as much.
Chuck, related to that, I want to ask a question about infrastructure, but not physical infrastructure. I want your thoughts on social infrastructure. What I'm getting at is, I'm sure in your neighborhood, mine too, we've seen a rise in mutual aid networks in the last few weeks. It's really been terrific, amazing to see. But if you think about it, just as you point out the traditional manner of town building, there was also a traditional manner of social care. And I think what's going to have to offset this terrible economic thing we're talking about has to be the supplementing of that with a rediscovery of neighborhood-based social care. Would you think something like that might be in the cards?
Yes. And I'm gonna ask everyone to be generous with me for a moment, because I'm gonna paint with a broad brush, understanding that there's a lot of nuance here. I've had the opportunity through Strong Towns to spend some time in neighborhoods that are Latino, are Hispanic neighborhoods, neighborhoods that in central Minnesota, where we have Norwegians, Swedes, and Finns, don't necessarily organically get a chance to interact with. A lot of these neighborhoods have been very poor. statistically, if we step back and we measure them the way Americans measure poverty, these have been places that have been very poor. I think you can say the same thing about the couple of Hasidic neighborhoods that have been allowed to invited into and been able to spend time with in New York City. Places that I would not have met if it weren't for this work with Strong Towns. In both of those places, what I witnessed is that the affluent luxury of, say, daycare it was absent. And what you had instead was community care. You had, I'm going to keep an eye on your kids. You're going to keep an eye on my kids. We're going to allow them to congregate here in public space. We're going to actually organize and orient our public space so that people can gather there safely and we can all kind of keep an eye on them. You had the old thing that, you know, I grew up on a road. This is going to tell you where I came from. The road is called Marohn Road today because of the high concentration of crazy people along there. But I grew up on Marohn Road for the first 5 years of my life before we moved to the old homestead. That road was literally, the first house was my grandparents. The second house was mine. The next one was my aunt's, then my uncle, then my other uncle, and then another uncle. So, you know, we all lived very close to each other. That meant that when I was outside, I was going to get my butt chewed out if I did something wrong by my aunt or my uncle or my grandma, because they were all kind of looking out for you. You see this when I was in these Hispanic neighborhoods. When you see in the Hasidic neighborhoods, what you see is a kind of community ownership of not only the civic space, but the civic culture, the back and forth. And I think I recognize that this is something we have, in a sense, bought our way out of. So instead of having, you know, grandma move in and live with us because we can't afford something else, we pay to send grandma to a nursing home. Instead of having the kids be kind of looked over by the neighborhood, we send them to a daycare facility. Those are things that affluent people do. I think as we become less affluent, or put another way, as we find better things to do with our money than throw it away on these things, I think we will find that those adaptations are very, very helpful. Alexander the Great had a live-in tutor named Socrates, or Aristotle, I'm sorry. He had, live-in people who raised him. That's always been something that the very wealthy had. I think that spreading that to the masses has been something that, you know, we've tried to do to emulate the very wealthy. I think it's one of those places where, as we become less wasteful in our wealth and more prudent in it, we'll find like that's an easy exchange to get more for less.
Chuck, I know we're running out of time, but I want to try to throw one more wrinkle into what you just said. I liked how you phrased that. You know, the wealthy have always had these kinds of opportunities. Everybody else, you know, made use of the resources, including, you know, the familial resources, the local civic resources that they had to accomplish that. Now, you could argue that wealth and technological development have made certain things more available to people. You know, you started out talking about how in Strong Towns you guys have made, you know, a lot of use of Zoom. And, you know, there's ways in which this kind of face-to-face interaction mediated by technology allows a kind of sharing of ideas and a kind of education that otherwise, you know, people that don't have the money to jump on a plane and go listen to, you know, a famous person lecture or something, never would have had options to. So in that way, you could say that the wealth has built upon the things that used to exist locally. But we can also think of a lot of examples in which wealth and all of our new gadgets, you know, haven't done a very good job at replicating this. I mean, you know, people will talk about like Facebook communities and, you know, all my close neighbors on Twitter, but we know it really doesn't function. the same way.
Right.
So what do you think? Do we just have to wait and see how development works out, whether this does in fact help, the option one cities, or it doesn't? Or do you think we can draw some lines and just say, we have a pretty good sense that after this point, you're not going to be able to improve upon the next door neighbor?
Let me give you an example. Before we went live in this broadcast, we actually talked about music for a while. And as someone who seriously pondered a career in music, and I'm not claiming that I'm an amazing musician, but enough to where like that was a real consideration, and a consideration that people had recommended to me. Adults when I was a kid had recommended to me as a career path. What I have recognized is that it is on one hand amazing that I get to download and listen to incredibly artistic and creative people, the best musicians that have ever lived. We watched Andrea Bocelli in the Duomo in Milan on Easter. I mean, what a divine treat that technology has brought to us and has allowed us to consume. On the other hand, I can tell you that the difference in skill between the person up the street who like plays guitar and is actually like a genius, and the person you hear on the radio is most times not that great. The fortunes that landed one on the radio and one, working as a janitor at the school, a part-time musician, is really comes down to a roll of the dice or luck or being in the right place at the right time, as opposed to like true inner talent and inner skill. I think when you recognize that, what you grasp is that, well, I think we can all appreciate the great musicians that we get to download and listen to and watch on devices. There is nothing like experiencing, a great musician practicing their craft at a local church, at a local pool hall, at a, local coffee shop. And those are actually, in many ways, more beautiful or equally beautiful, at least, and certainly more intimate and meaningful. And I think what we have seen is where we've made room for that in our civic society, where we found places for that. We've all benefited from it and appreciated it. I think you can take that insight and just translate it over many, many dimensions of society and say that, yes, we're all going to benefit from Zoom. We all benefit from being, I would not have ever met Elias if not for Facebook. So we, deeply benefit from that. And I've enjoyed our friendship, which has largely been online. But as much as I admire and appreciate Elias and I've enjoyed some time together with him, the most meaningful interactions that I have are, with my high school teacher who lives 3 houses down, who I've gotten to know in a different way because we're neighbors now. The woman who lives next door, whose husband passed away and she's now widowed, and we, go over and check on her and chat with her. These are like deeply meaningful relationships. And I think we all as humans intuitively understand that the person making the music at church is a gift for us. The person next door who we can share something with is a gift for us. I think we all intuitively understand that the coronavirus is giving us a chance to appreciate it. And I think that appreciation is something that we're not going to give up easily.
That's good. That's good. Chuck, that's great. Shall we close down? Russell, thank you very much for participating today.
Thank you for suggesting it, Elias. I really had fun listening to you and Chuck discuss these ideas.
Same here. It's great to see you guys.
Likewise. Thank you for the conversation, and I deeply appreciate it. I have some things that will keep my brain occupied for the afternoon too.
Did you want to say something about the Ask Me Anything on Thursday?
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. On Thursday, as is our
I'm doing your job.
Practice. No, thanks for reminding me because I forgot. We are going to do a follow-up Ask Me Anything. And so after this, if you are a participant, you're going to get an email telling you where to go and get signed up for that. And if you're connected with Strong Towns, we're going to send you out an email and let you know too. So thank you. Thanks for that reminder. We'll see you back here on Thursday.
Great. As
Thank
Jim
you.
Kessler says, we will ride again.
We'll ride again.
Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.